Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Migration and Climate Change Seminar Series here at the University of East Anglia School of Global Development. My name is Dr. Ritika Subramanian, and I co-convene this seminar series with Dr. Mark Tebbit and Professor Nitya Rao as part of the Successful Intervention Pathways for Migration as Adaptation Research Project that is supported by the FCDO and IDRC under the Climate Adaptation and Resilience Program. Today, we're delighted to host Dr. Robert Oakes. Robert works in the Environment and Migration Interactions and Choices Division at the United Nations University Institute for Environment and Human Security. He researches the reasons for and outcomes of mobility, including evacuation, displacement, voluntary migration, planned relocation, in addition to those who are unwilling or unable to move. In so doing, he hopes to contribute to understanding in which circumstances mobility should be considered a form of adaptation and when it represents loss and damage. Over to you, Rob. We're really looking forward to this seminar.
Thank you very much. Yes, it's a pleasure to be invited, and thank you for joining. So yeah, that was a nice introduction, so I think I don't need to introduce myself really. Just the title, it sounds very grand, Methodological Advances in Climate Mobility Research. My idea is just to talk about what research methods can and should and might do to kind of advance the field. And I'll be talking about a couple of specific research methods that we've been using both recently and in the past, Q method and different forms of modeling human mobility as well. Just because no one ever really knows what UN University is, I should very briefly mention who and what we are. So this is where I'm sat at the moment in the United Nations Tower in Bonn in Germany. And we're in the Institute for Environment and Human Security, one of the 13 institutes of the United Nations University. And this is a think tank of the UN. So we're called university and we do a little bit of teaching, but mainly it's research. So think tank is probably the best description of what we do. As Ritika mentioned, our team is called the Environment and Migration Interactions and Choices team. We thought that was quite a clever wording to call ourselves EMIC or EMIC. The idea is that a lot of our research is kind of people-centered, and we're very much interested in this idea of choice and any and all interactions of environment and mobility. And yeah, just I put human mobility in the context of climate change as the kind of wording that we generally use in our team to describe climate migration, climate mobilities, whatever you want. I understand there is importance and difficulty within all these terms, but this is one that we've agreed upon, somewhat inspired by GIZ, who are one of our main funders. And very briefly, what we're trying to do as a team is unite science, policy, and practice on human mobility in the context of climate and environmental change. So as well as research, we're trying to align findings with policy frameworks to be able to produce outcomes for global frameworks, for national policies, etc. Okay, so I just want to mention briefly sort of where we're at. It's a very simplistic understanding I'm going to provide of where we're at with climate mobilities, but I've titled this Aspirations and Capabilities We Aspire, but Are We Capable? So since I've been working in the field, I've been working maybe not as long as all of you, the last 10 years, I suppose, within climate mobilities migration. Before that, I did a PhD that was more in risk and evacuation, but related fields. So we're kind of moving from climate migration to mobility, mobilities, and this, of course, is informed by a range of other theories within risk, within disasters, but especially within migration theory. And perhaps most important in the last 15 years has been the Foresight reports, which was kind of explaining mobility or migration isn't deterministic. It's, of course, there's lots of different drivers which interact. There's very rarely a deterministic link between environmental climate change and moving. And more recently, from the migration literature, there's a bit more emphasis on the aspirations and capabilities framework. And at our recent conference on environment and climate mobilities that we hosted in Bonn this year, it was just omnipresent. And I don't mean that in a negative sense, but lots of young researchers, lots of established researchers are using this framework. And it kind of made me think, we're using this framework and it's a good way of understanding what's going on, but how can we actually use it to actually focus on what these words mean? What does aspiration mean? What does capability mean? So aspiration, I've put a context-specific need or desire to move. And the capability, again, very much context-specific. It's the ability to manifest a decision. So can you move? And what's very important is that the two are linked. So we have this idea of the aspiration to be capable, but also the capacity to aspire. So I think that the main authors within this field are very much aware that these aren't separate ideas. There is flow between the two. So just very briefly, on the left is a sort of cartoon version of the black model. This is something that we put together, this nice design for an e-learning course that we put together a couple of years ago. We're currently updating. So we have a range of factors which are producing a kind of desire to move, but whether this desire actually manifests in move is conditioned by other characteristics. And on the right-hand side, the aspirations and capabilities model, it's basically just turning this model through 90 degrees and expanding upon it, because we have the factors at the top, macro level factors, but then it's also applying the meso level and the micro level factors. And I think what's important are these arrows to the right, which are connecting up the aspiration and the ability to migrate. And of course, we have a link to the different forms of mobility. So yeah, in this way, we can see that aspirations and capabilities is a kind of natural progression extension of the black model. And aspirations and capabilities excellent for kind of explaining and categorizing migration. I always find this diagram a little bit problematic because mobility is a bit kind of limited. We don't have displacement in here because displacement is also there is a capability to migrate, but an aspiration to stay. But this does a nice job of categorizing forms of mobility. But what I want to briefly talk about is, yeah, how do we actually use this in real life? How do we test it? How do we refine it? And also, how do we project it if we're thinking about modeling as well? And the reason I'm interested in this is because if I can rewind a few years, when I did my PhD, it was actually looking at hurricane evacuation. And my central thesis was that people don't always evacuate when they're supposed to evacuate. So the figure here has evacuation warnings. This is kind of representative of just information. Plus, this is a hurricane evacuation bus stop. So it means that local authorities actually provide assistance if you can't move, but this doesn't actually lead to 100% evacuation. So what I'm saying here is that technical approaches of understanding risk information, plus socioeconomic approaches where we understand risk as structurally determined. These are very important. I don't know if they're the most important, but they don't explain all of risk and risk response. And what I tried to do in my PhD was also to bring in psychological and cultural framings of risk to try and better understand why people do or don't move. And I've turned these subjective paradigms of risk because they're very much within the individual. They can be within a community, within a household, but they very much exist within brains. And yeah, so this made me think about what are the difficulties in understanding why people move. Because if we think about aspirations, we can define, expand, use synonyms for these desires, aspirations, needs, regrets, wishes, ambitions. There are so many different things going on in people's heads that make them want to take a course of action, particularly with moving. And when I was doing my PhD, it made sense for me to adopt the theory of planned behavior, which basically says that actions are conditioned by your attitudes, what you think about an action, the subjective norm, how society influences your opinion of these, but also your perceived behavioral control, if you think that you're going to be able to carry out an action. And this is rather similar to this kind of capability to aspire to be capable as well. I'm not going to go off on too much of a tangent, but this is just for me to say that this subjective position is very important. You need to understand what's going on in someone's head, and quite a big part of this is their attitudes. What I used in my PhD and have used ever since actually is Q methods. And this was an attempt to try and drill down into what's going on in people's heads, how are they making decisions. And this is because surveys can be a bit simplistic. You can have a Likert scale. You can say, how do you feel about situation Y? Grade it 1 to 7. You can get a lot of data, and there's, world values survey which has a lot of data. But if each of those data points are limited, you're not going to really understand processes in people's brains. You can have focus groups, expert interviews. This is extremely important for understanding the kind of big picture. But unless you're directly interacting with a migrant who might be making a decision or has made that decision, you're not getting that same information or data. Participatory processes, I'm a big fan of actually, but they might be accused of lacking vigor. Of course, it's very difficult to generalize from a participatory process as well. And then, just finally, I would argue, does anyone really know why they do anything? Because you might think in your head on some level of consciousness why you carry out a particular action, but in fact, there might be other things going on that you're not aware of, really. So actually just asking someone, why did you migrate? You might get an answer. Oh, it was because I wanted to get a job. Oh, it's because the economy was in a bad state, or I'm fed up of all these floods. But that doesn't necessarily mean why, give us a very trustworthy picture of why an action actually happened. So with Q methods, I think it's not perfect, but I think in some ways it's able to tackle some of these issues. So in terms of simplistic surveys, Q method enables a kind of deep thinking by the researcher to understand what a participant is thinking. And through the process, the participant is forced, or let's say asked, to think very deeply about their position. And this is why I've put, they operationalize their subjectivity. So it directly focuses on the person who you want to find out about, and they undertake an activity to construct their reality or operationalize their subjectivity, if I can use the jargon. So it's a qualitative method, but it uses some quantitative analysis. Of course, it requires a little bit of interpretation by the researcher, so there is possibility of bias. And yeah, the last point, because Q is a particular sorting activity, I'll explain in a minute, it doesn't ask directly, why did you do something? It kind of works as a form of deduction, a quantified form of deduction, we could say. So yeah, I'm not saying that Q is the best method for doing this. I'm just saying it's one way of doing this, and it's a nice tool to experiment with. So basically, all Q does, we can see here's a woman, she's performing Q sort. You basically read a set of statements and you sort them onto a grid, and the grid is labeled from most disagree to most agree. So the participant picks up a statement, reads it, decides the extent to which they agree, and then places it on the grid. So that's them kind of ranking each statement. They are representing their worldview. And it comes from social psychology and developed in the mid-20th century, but I think the last probably 20 years, it's really been used in geography and related fields. And yeah, we've been using it at UNU the last decade. So it can be used for anything, but I think it's particularly well suited to looking at decision making. There is a process. I'm not going to talk about all of them because there's not much time, but essentially you collect and sample lots of statements. You get some participants to rank the statements. That's the Q sort process, and then you do the analysis and interpretation. So basically, just to collect the statements, you need to get.
Rob, sorry, could I just interrupt briefly? If you go back to the previous slide on
Mm,
your Q sort grid, you've explained the kind of horizontal or x-axis, but could you also just briefly explain what the kind of the depth of the grid means, or the kind of why would something appear on the bottom and why does it get narrower?
in fact, I'm coming to that. Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Um,
Apologies for interrupting then.
it's quite all right. Yeah. Okay, so when you're collecting the statements, basically you want to try and get a whole range of opinions on the particular issue. So this is a Q study I did on Pacific Island states. Are people thinking about moving within the country or perhaps overseas to Australia or New Zealand? So to get the statements that you want to be ranked, you'd look at a range of, you could either get the statements from focus groups, that's probably the purest way to do it, or a more realistic way would be to scan the literature. So it could be academic papers, it could be grey literature. And actually, we've also used just kind of finding things which are in the ether on social media, for example. And when you might have a couple of hundred statements, but then you need to sample them to make it viable to do as an activity. So you might want to use theory or concepts for the sampling. So this is what we used when we were in the Pacific. So we used some overarching themes: climate change, migration, adaptation, some generic themes on sustainable development, environment, economy, and society. And then we looked at culture in terms of land, relocation, and religion. And then within each of those 9 categories, we had 4 statements to get 36 statements in total. So you can see under climate change, we had the angry sea will kill us all. It's quite good to have some maybe slightly exciting statements to make the process interesting and to get a good conversation going. This will satisfy Mark, I hope. So the Q-sort process, it can be done online. There are tools to do this. I could supply some links. I haven't done it. But it's actually much better to do it in person because you can have a eye-to-eye conversation. And what actually happens is you have the grid here, and as participants are looking at a statement, they're going to think, oh yeah, I definitely agree with this. But they'll look at this bell-shaped curve. They can only place the statement on the white square, because what we want to do as researchers is to really find out what is it that you feel most strongly about, most agree, most disagree. So this is about the kind of operationalizing the subjectivity. So they're having to think quite hard. Do I feel more strongly that the angry sea will kill us all, or do I feel more strongly that our community bonds will keep us strong? So this can be a little bit challenging for the participants, but it's quite helpful to just kind of encourage them. Please keep to this shape because it helps with analysis. And when before or after doing a sort, it's quite nice to do a short survey questions. You could find out their migration history, for example, and then classically you would ask, your age, highest level of education, gender, etc., size of household, perhaps. Then the analysis, you use factor analysis. So there's specific programs which do this. It's quite easy, actually. And essentially what you're doing is factor analysis is just a method of boiling down the data, so it simplifies. So with this study, I think we interviewed 20 people, and we entered the sort information into the program. through the factor analysis, you get 4 shared kind of idealized sorts. So I just kind of snipped, and it's not very clear actually, but I titled them here. A resourceful people will adapt is the first one. Number 2, we need dignified migration from the inevitable. Number 3, climate change is already here. Relocation might be the only answer. And number 4, our faith in community will overcome. So this was a study we did. This was in Tuvalu. And then in order to understand what this means from all the data, you can kind of convert a semi-quantitative file into a narrative that's kind of easy to understand. And this is the main output of a Q study. So we'd have a subjective understanding 4. So I've just highlighted a few elements of this. This narrative could be as long as you want. This is from an article where we're actually talking about sorts in Kiribati, Nauru, and Tuvalu, so there wasn't much space to write this, but in my PhD, I think I wrote a couple of pages for each one. Here it's just 100 words or so. But yeah, it gives you a real kind of understanding of a shared conceptualization of whatever the statements are about. So in this case, it was statements about how people think about the current situation in terms of, well, all the statements I had here. In terms of the overarching themes, which are kind of in the background, climate change, migration, adaptation. But what I was particularly interested in was also culture and how this interacts with people's decision making. So in the end, what this narrative subjective understanding shows is one way of people conceptualizing what is happening in Tuvalu with regards to climate change, migration, and culture, etc. So what mainly we've used Q method for investigating decision making. So for mobile or immobile populations, I think the immobile is because originally I used it in my PhD looking at non-evacuation mainly, but it equally can, the same rules apply really for any form of mobility. So yeah, it could be for evacuation, it could be for migration. What's actually quite interesting, what we've done recently with Anne-Christine, my colleague, is we had a paper on Fiji looking at planned relocation. So it could be about a specific part of a specific form of human mobility. It could be for a specific group. It could be for anything really. And a couple of years ago, we put on a workshop at University of Vienna to try and promote the gospel here. So we now have a few other universities who are also using Q method for other research projects. And there's a few papers we published. This was the one I mentioned on Pacific Small and Developing States. It doesn't need to be about decision making. I suppose because I was kind of interested, I worked with a visiting researcher to understand roles of international organizations who are working on disaster displacement. So we also interviewed people from UNHCR and IOM to understand how they conceptualize mobility and displacement. So it could be used in other aspects. And this was the latest one that Anne-Christine led on Fiji, which I will just finish this part with. So this was, I include this partly because it has a lovely picture on the right. So this is the way that we sample the statements, because we were looking at well-being here, essentially. So the situation is explained on the left. This was looking at partial relocation. So a planned relocation is when a whole community moves due to climate risk, but in reality, this often takes place partially. So what was quite interesting, and I think it was the first study to do this, was to look at outcomes of communities where only part of the community had actually moved and some of them had stayed in place, supposedly at risk. And we were able to look at two different case studies. So one that happened 10 years ago and one which is ongoing. And yeah, you can read the paper, so I won't go into the detail, but we found that this is quite a nice way of kind of revealing the complexities within those who had moved and those who had stayed. I'm aware. Do I have another 5 minutes?
Yeah,
How
you do.
if-
Yeah, 10, 15 minutes, fine. 10 minutes.
Oh, okay.
10 minutes is good, yeah.
No, that's good then. Okay. All right. So I'm going to completely jump, and this maybe to the audience this doesn't seem connected, but in my mind it is fairly connected, because we, having talked about using Q to try and sort of drill down into what's happening within these concepts. Another aspect of our work is trying to do something a little bit similar, or at least apply the same, I think, open-mindedness to modeling. So people have, I think, maybe quite strong opinions about models, and I think it more or less fits into those who model, who think they're great, and those who don't model, who maybe think they're not so great. I think I'm somewhere in the middle because I've done a bit of modeling in the past. At the moment, I'm working with a team of modelers at UNU to try and, I suppose, humanize their models a little bit. So I think they are here to stay. And in the time I've been working at UNU, I see that model results which are projecting mobility in the future are getting more and more coverage, and they're getting more coverage in policy processes as well. So we're thinking that because this is the way it's going, even if I might have slight reservations about how models are done, I think it's okay to try and be part of this process and shape it and hopefully improve it. The big dream for us is that we influence UNFCCC and particularly loss and damage debate. So if we think there's this loss and damage fund, which eventually may go to the people who need the money, and if we can produce some evidence to show the risks of not adapting, or what we think will happen even if there is adaptation, then perhaps we can inform these debates and perhaps contribute to decisions with funding. That's in the long run anyway. But until now, I think lots of models can form into a couple of different camps. There's probably more, but essentially economists, when they're modeling human mobility, tend to assume maximum utility. This is what economists are often trying to do. But this is, if we're thinking about rational actors, then we're not really thinking about the complexities of the human mind and how people might not do what's in their interest always. Then engineers or climate scientists will probably look at natural data more, modeling ecological systems using GIS, and these can be deterministic. Of course, some of these models can introduce other aspects. I'm just setting the scene as this is generally the approach. And I think this is because of disciplinary bias, but of course also because it's difficult to model these. So I'm not saying that other modelers are doing this because they're not aware of these problems. I think it's just, if there's not the data to support it or the theory to support it, then it's difficult. And if you have a project that's depending on it, or a funding that's depending on it, then experimenting becomes a bit more difficult. And yeah, how actually do we model aspirations and capabilities? So yeah, just very briefly. So the groundswell report is probably the kind of most talked about report. It's still quoted so COP happened a few weeks ago. Groundswell report will be mentioned at all of those sessions which talk about climate mobility, and when the media write it up, they'll mention these numbers, for example. And this is a gravity model that assumes that people will move to kind of maximize their utility with regards to jobs and especially water. So if there's too much or too little water, they'll move. And it uses a range of demographic, socioeconomic, geographic data. I think does quite a good job. And yeah, I included this graph at the bottom. Attention rate of time, it gets a lot of coverage. They had a second iteration a couple of years ago as well. And then you get other, maybe more alarmist reports that, because they have big figures in, get a lot of coverage as well. So this was the Ecological Threat Register that came out a few years ago, saying that climate crisis could displace 1.2 billion people. It's a lot of people. And then if you drill down into their methodology, what they're doing basically is they're saying that there are 740 people who are at risk of resources in the context of climate change. And then there's others who are at risk of, disasters. I think natural hazards would be better. And they're basically saying, oh, okay, there's a few duplicates here, so we'll just minus a few and we come up with 1.2 billion. So a bit simplistic, we could say. So we are actually working with the Internal Displacement Monitoring Centre. For those of you who don't know, that's the kind of standard bearer of displacement data. So every year they collect data on the number of people newly displaced by all sorts of events, by conflict and climate-related hazards. And they also produce data on how many people are in a state of displacement at the end of the year. So looking at prolonged displacement as well. Before we started working with them, this was their model. So risk was a function of hazard, exposure, and vulnerability. And our role in the project is, our role as a whole was to look at all of this model. My role and a colleague's role was to look at vulnerability, because previously it was just looking at buildings vulnerability. And if you're a geographer or in a related social science field, this is a bit of a strange definition of vulnerability, because for me, it's more like exposure. So we were asked to contribute to this. So when we're thinking about this, we're just trying to think, how can we better define vulnerability for it to kind of align with these frameworks I've mentioned? And is it possible to introduce an element of agency in this model? So can we learn from migration and mobilities theory to make it less simplistic? So we've been working on this, and we're using a probabilistic model, which uses hazard exposure and vulnerability. So in some ways, it's not a massive change from this, but what we have been doing is expanding on the vulnerability concept. So we have a paper that came out a few months ago in Environmental Research Climate that explains, but essentially what we're doing is trying to bring in a little bit of the foresight model, and we have thoughts about bringing in aspirations and capabilities, and we're making some progress, but we haven't gotten there yet. So within the model, in fact, maybe I'll go here first. We're looking at these 4 different hazards: tropical cyclone, coastal flood, river flood, and drought. And if you look at the vulnerability column here, the vulnerability is still more or less related to building damage, except if you look at drought here, we've tried to bring in an element of systemic vulnerability. So social, demographic, economic, environmental, and political factors. And the idea here, of course, is this is called displacement, but really it's rather similar to migration, because drought displacement, drought migration, is quite difficult to separate the two. So what we're saying is we're adopting essentially something related to the foresight model. So we managed to get indicators for one of each of the points of the Pentagon: social food security, political government effectiveness, demographic dependency ratio, economic HDI, and environmental. We're looking at nature dependency. And I think what was quite nice was that we can use, to keep the modelers happy, we have to get data which is reliable, robust, available for every country. So we have a bit of a division here. Some country level data looking at government effectiveness, and in terms of demography dependency ratio, and in terms of social food security, but also some local data to really try and understand what might be going on at the local level. And when there's local level data, of course, it's much better, but modelers don't really want to be using local level data in combination with country level data if it's not available for every region. So this is essentially what we've done, which is a starting point that kind of satisfied me coming from a geography or mobility perspective, but the data seemed acceptable for the modelers. And what we've managed to produce is multi-hazard displacement risk model. If you look at the legend on the right, this is that average annual displacement, AAD. And essentially, this is just saying how many displacements there would be in each region by 2100. So a bit of an increase. I think the kind of global level statistics are probably most useful because it will iron out the perhaps slight emergent data issues by country. But this another way of looking at it is to actually just look at it by hazard. But what's been probably most useful is to think about the dashboard, which is hosted on the IDMC website. And this will give very indicative figures for each of the countries. And of course, they should be taken with a dollop of salt, but they're essentially showing what could happen under certain situations by year X. So here we have global model, but we also have by country as well. So this is for Iraq, and you can see at the top it has the specific type of hazard as well. And for Philippines as well, we have something similar. So this is a QR code. If you like, you can take a look at it, or later after I share the slides. And it gives a bit of an understanding of what's happening in that country. But for now, I think what we want to just sort of show is this is a way of showing data. It's not us saying this is wonderful data right now. And that's because we're still working on the model. We're coming to the end of the second part of the model, the second part of the project. And this is what we want to do, but until now, I think we're not going to actually introduce. And there are a couple of major changes here. So first of all, you can see it in the top blue boxes, housing, infrastructure, and livelihoods. Yes, they're there. And if you look down the model, you'll see that livelihoods doesn't relate to all of the hazards. But the second blue box, we're trying to look at medium term and longer term displacement. So this is what IDMC, and this is what states, this is what the UN is really interested in, because we're trying to find out, is it possible to understand, to project what's going to happen with medium term and long term displacement? Because this is where the harm is done. This is where the loss and damage occurs. And this is also, if I'm being blunt, this is where the money is most relevant. If people are thinking about the level of money that it's necessary to invest to avoid this, or the level of money it will be needed to address this, or to even compensate in the future. And then if you look on the right, our plan is to try and address capability as well. Honestly, it's been quite difficult. We're still working on this. So aspirations we feel kind of okay about. So we have our approach from the previous iteration, which we're expanding. So there's going to be a few more indicators, but based on what I've shown you. Capability, a bit more difficult. So we'll think of capability in terms of can move and willing to move, but then willing to move also maybe as part of Aspirations as well. So we're still working on this. But yeah, we were thinking of, yeah, do we just come up with, say, a figure below which people aren't able to move, a figure above which people don't feel able to move, don't need to move, so bringing in some sort of migration hump theory perhaps. And then we're thinking about cultural factors. Getting data on cultural factors is tough, so it'd be nice if you have any ideas. We've been looking at World Values Survey, for example, but there's nothing that's necessarily fabulous. Something on place attachment would be nice as well, but that possibly crosses into Aspirations as well. So anyway, we're working on this. So this isn't really much of a conclusion. I just wanted to sort of say this is what personally we're working on at UNU-EHS. We're trying to reconcile qualitative and quantitative approaches, and I would say that Q method is one way of bringing some sort of quantitative rigor and analysis, but I think more than that, it's just a way of trying to sort of open someone's head and see what's going on inside. Of course, it's not perfect, but I think it's a better way of asking someone why they are thinking of moving, because they're kind of deeply thinking about different ideas and then creating a representation of how they feel, which you're then putting through a statistical program to bring the rigor to it. But yeah, I think I went very quickly through the modeling part, but I definitely think it's important that modeling can try to bring in these qualitative advances. And honestly, it is a bit difficult. And we've presented these ideas at conferences. We have this paper, but it's very much a work in progress. We still want to see it's very much a balance between satisfying what's conceptually accurate and what there's data for, and what works when it's actually being modeled. So it's quite a nice activity, but I think it's not something that can be solved in the next year or two. But yeah, just sort of more generally, I just think it's very important to integrate research. So in terms of methods and disciplines, so in the modeling project, we're working with climate modelers, risk modelers, and then trying to bring in some sort of expertise on climate mobility. I think a modeler needs to bring in other expertise, essentially. And of course, we need all forms of integration from the global north and majority worlds, across gender. All of this is necessary to get a richer picture. But also, what I'm very passionate about is differentiating in research. And working within the UN, we see a lot of value in producing standardized data, standardized reports to get understandings of what is happening in a particular context. But there's also a big need to just continue to experiment and to evolve. And yeah, if we're playing about with these, if we're playing about with aspirations and capabilities, perhaps we can refine the concept, the framework. Maybe that's not what I'm interested in, but I want to see, can we actually apply that to something so we can eventually inform policy and planning and programming. And that's it. Thank you very much.
Lovely. Thanks. Thanks very much, Rob. That was a really fascinating presentation, looking across all of the modelling stuff, as well as some of the theories around early theories, I guess, reflecting how we're kind of thinking about migration and displacement, as well as the Q-sort methodology. So really, really super. I very much enjoyed it. We've got just a little over 10 minutes left for any questions. So let's see how we're going. Someone has got their hand up. So Roland's got a question. So Roland, if you fire away, and then if anybody else has any questions as well, stick your hand up. It'd be good to maybe take 2 or 3 in one hit if possible. So Roland, you go first and we'll we'll take it from there.
Yeah, it was interesting where you started. It probably shows our shared lineage at Sussex, but going from theory of planned behaviour to aspirations capabilities, which I think is quite interesting, and I try to do very badly in a paper because I think there's something that draws them both that's really useful. So, I mean, if you had any thoughts on that, that would be really interesting to hear, but that's sort of in the weeds slightly. The other thing with the aspirations capabilities in terms of displacement, it tends to be just a comment on it, and something that I've been kind of wrangling with, which kind of mentioned before, is you have the capability is often framed in the capability to migrate, but under those conditions of displacement, it becomes a question of, do you have capability to remain, to rebuild and recover, and that threshold seems to be critical when you are, from my perspective, when you're thinking about that transition from what is displacement characterized as short term, short distance, and how that then turns into something which is longer term displacement or more permanent migration. So it's just in terms of modeling, have you looked at where you place that threshold for considered aspirational migration in terms of pursuing that aspiration, and where you put the threshold for having the capability to to remain and rebuild under conditions of duress?
Okay, that's the first question. In the absence of any other people, I will add. I'll add one in, and then over to you, Neil, and then Rob will then come to you for some thoughts or responses. And I guess my one is a bit of a more general. It'd be great to get your just general reflections. I think you've been alluding to it in your presentation about maybe some of the frontiers in relation to modelling and where you think modelling needs to go in relation to displacement and migration, but perhaps any reflections you have about where you think the next kind of big advances, looking at understanding migration, where you think those are possibly in relation to modelling or not. So kind of the direction of travel that we're headed in relation to migration and displacement from a scientific knowledge generation perspective. Great to hear your thoughts on that. And then over to you, Neil.
Thanks so much. Both good questions, Roland and Mark. So I'll try to take it a slightly different direction then. Thanks so much, Robert. Really enjoyed that. It's really good to talk about methods, and certainly a number of us on the call, who've worked on large-scale projects or working together, we have to have these conversations. You make a point, I guess, about, or you looked at different, or have, I guess, quite a make a standard set of points about the limits of existing methods, about rigor and robustness of them. But I guess when we've been discussing a lot of these, there is only really one criteria or one overarching criteria for the choice of methods, which is appropriateness. And that appropriateness for the research question. So, and I'm sure if you just reflect a little on that, which is there is no superior, there's no method to rule them all. There's just appropriate methods for appropriate research questions, particularly around their explanatory power, and particularly around the issue of causality. So if you could just reflect a little on that and say something about causality, what causes what, and the appropriate methods to look at that in the context of climate and migration research. Thanks. That's great.
Okay. Thanks all. So Roland, yeah. Shared lineage. Yeah, so I always have a soft spot for the theory of planned behavior, and I think I also like patterns. So in my head, they are very similar. I suppose, well, of course, the difference is that aspirations and capabilities was designed to try and understand migration. So of course that works. it does a very similar thing, I think, to the theory of planned behavior. If we think about the way that, perceived behavioral control, social norms interact, the arrows and relationships between aspirations and capabilities do quite a similar thing, I would say. I kind of stumbled into going through the theory of planned behavior in my PhD, and that's how I ended up with Q methods. And when I was presenting today, I wanted to just sort of show that was my process. That's why Q methods was, let's say, appropriate for me, because I was very much thinking about that psychological lens. So if we're thinking about understanding someone's thought processes, this is a psychological issue, and therefore a psychological method can work. I was more showing that they are similar than saying that theory of planned behavior is better, actually. But I see good common ground between them. In terms of displacement and agency, we are currently on the next iteration. We are playing around with the dependency ratio to see what this brings, because young dependents tend to be more displaced, older dependents tend not to be displaced, and of course this is colored by the countries in which these populations exist as well. So yeah, this kind of capability to remain is something that we're trying to look at, and of course it's somewhat economic, but at the moment what looks promising is looking at age as well. Mark, modeling. Yeah, I think I very briefly mentioned what is needed. I don't know if it's in advance, but the temporal aspect of displacement, we could say of modeling migration more generally, but within displacements, IDMC have done some work on this over the last couple of years. They've just started, but of course they're having funding cut and it's quite difficult to continue. But we have had discussions and we want to look at this, because I think what we were imagining is that there are different drivers of vulnerability for protracted displacement than there are for drivers of short-term displacement. And it might be the best way would be to separate the two and model immediate displacement and protracted displacement, or maybe the more sensible way is just to model displacement and have some indicators, half of those indicators turn out to have something relevant for the duration of the displacement. But yeah, displacement data in terms of duration is not particularly good. So we've had a few nice sessions with IDMC talking through the data, what it can, what it can't do, what they have collected, what they can collect. But essentially, countries who are the main sources of this data, they stop reporting displaced populations after a few weeks. So it's very difficult. There'll be a lot of assumptions there. I'm not sure that's insurmountable, and it's something that's on our list for the kind of third iteration. So we're doing this in year chunks. We've about to finish the second year of the project, so the second mini project. The next one, if we're a bit satisfied with having introduced vulnerability to all of the other modules, we're also looking at geophysical hazards now as well, not climate related, but earthquakes and volcanoes as well. But if we're kind of satisfied with that, then the next stage will be to look at duration. And Neil, yes, rigor and robust. I mean, you're right. I wasn't saying that Q is the best. I suppose, again, my original thinking behind using that was to try and really drill down what's happening in this particular circumstance when I was trying to understand hurricane evacuation in the States. And then I found it worked for unveiling what people were thinking. And I suppose this also comes back to I was trying to think, how can I find something that would work to then be used for a model? Because in the PhD, I use this for a model within an agent-based model. But there are, of course, many other ways of doing this. I suppose what I was saying, that rigor, robust, whatever that means, but I'm not a big fan of just asking someone why they left. So I think something a bit more in depth is what I'm advocating for, really. And in terms of, causality, I think, lots of these other models I mentioned briefly will consider causality in terms of, maybe an econometric approach or maybe a more engineering approach. And I think that, of course, has value, but ideally it will be backed up with some kind of deeper research to try and understand what that is. It could be a question in a survey, but I think it'd be better if it was a deeper conversation, such as Q. But of course, there are other methods as well.
Lovely. Thanks very much. And that brings us very nicely to the top of the hour, Rob. It was almost like you timed your response to fit the perfect time available. So with that, I should like to thank you, Robert, very much for your time and thoughts today. Very much appreciate those. Thanks also to Ritika, who's on my screen, for doing the legwork with all of the organising and the introduction at the start. And then before I go, Ritika, I'll just hand over to you just to announce our next seminar.
Okay, thank you, Robert. So next week we'll be meeting again. It's on Wednesday next week, on December 3rd, and we'll be hosting Professor Tasneem Siddiqui, who'll be discussing her work in Bangladesh. We'll send out the invites, but hope to see a lot of you there as well. Thank you.